There are things a man remembers not because they were loud, but because they were right. A dovetail joint cut so clean it needed no peg to hold. A roof pitched at exactly the angle that snow wants to leave. A wall laid up so square that 40 years of settling couldn't pull it a quarter inch out of true. These are the things a carpenter carries. Not the big jobs, not the ones that paid the most or impressed the most people. The ones that were simply, completely right. In a way that made you stop what you were doing and look the way you stop and look when a bird lands close enough that you can see the detail of its feathers. I have built a good many structures in my years along the Crow-Wing River. I have forgotten most of them, but I have not forgotten what Ingrid Solberg built in the summer of 1880, behind her cabin on the south-facing slope above the creek. I have not forgotten it because I watched it save 3 families through the worst winter this county ever recorded, while the rest of us were burning green wood and breathing smoke and praying for March. It was a young man who made me tell this story. He was standing right where you're sitting now, in front of this store, on an afternoon much like this one, pointing down the road at one of the old farmsteads. You could see it from here in those days, before the elms grew up along the fence line. He pointed at the lean-to structure running south from the old cabin wall, at the covered corridor connecting it to the barn, and he said it the way young men say things they believe they already understand. Old Norwegian style, he said. You see that all through this part of the county. The Scandinavians built everything connected. It's just how they did things. I put down my coffee. I am not a man who corrects people often. I have found over 70 years that most people do not want to be corrected. They want to be agreed with, which is a different thing entirely. But there are times when letting something go uncorrected feels like a small kind of theft from someone who deserved better. Sit down, I said. That design came from one woman, and she was not trying to be Norwegian. She was trying to not die. There is a difference, and it matters. And I am going to tell you whose it was. His name doesn't matter. What matters is that he sat down and listened, and by the time I was finished, he wrote a name on a piece of paper and folded it into his coat pocket. That name was Ingrid Solberg. I watched his hand write it. It was the first time in 40 years anyone had asked me to say it out loud, and I want to tell you that is a fact I am not entirely proud of. Now, before I tell you what she built, I need to tell you about the wood. Minnesota is not Dakota. People make that mistake. They hear northern frontier, and they think treeless prairie, sun houses, not a stick of timber for 50 miles. That is Dakota. That is Kansas. Along the Crow-Wing in 1880 there were trees, good trees, white pine, bur oak, basswood growing thick along the river bottoms. A man could find timber within a mile of his claim if he was willing to work for it. The problem was not the supply of wood. The problem was the wood itself. A tree that is cut down in September is still mostly alive inside. The wood holds moisture in every fiber. Sometimes nearly half its weight is water. Loggers call it green wood, and there is nothing wrong with green wood for building. It dries slowly over months and becomes solid, reliable timber. But you cannot burn green wood and expect much from it. It smolders. It fills a room with a gray, acrid smoke that coats the walls and stings the eyes and sits heavy in the lungs of children. And for all that smoke, it gives you perhaps half the heat of dry wood, a third on a bad night. On a Minnesota night in January, when the temperature has not climbed above 0 in 3 weeks, half the heat is not enough. What every family along the Crow-Wing faced in those years was a timing problem. You cut wood in September because that is when there is time to cut it. The crops are in, the ground is still open, the days are long enough to work from light to light. But September wood does not dry enough to burn well by November. It needs until the following spring, sometimes longer, depending on how it is stacked and what weather it sees. Families who had been on their land for 5 or 6 years had solved this by maintaining a rolling stock. always burning last year's wood, always drying this year's wood. But new families, and families who had used more than they planned, and families that had lost a season to illness or injury or bad luck, were burning whatever they had, which meant burning wood that was not ready, which meant smoke and cold and children who woke up shivering before dawn. This was not a Dakota problem. In Dakota, the wood froze and got buried in snow. In Minnesota, the wood stood in your yard and still would not give you what you needed because it was green, because you had cut it too recently, because time had not yet done the work that only time can do. That was the problem Ingrid Solberg understood before anyone else on the Crow Wing. And understanding it was the first thing that separated her from her neighbors. She had come from Telemark, in the south of Norway, with her husband Gunnar in the spring of 1869. She was 30 years old then, with 2 sons already. Lars, a round-faced 6-year-old who had cried for 3 days when they boarded the ship in Christiania, and Eric, 4, who had not cried at all and seemed to find the whole business an adventure. A daughter, Astrid, was born on the Minnesota claim in 1871. Gunnar Solberg was a decent man and a willing worker, which is the best thing you could say about a man in that country in those years. He was not clever in the way that some men are clever. He did not see around corners or plan far ahead, but he showed up every morning and put in a full day and did not complain about the things that could not be changed. He and Ingrid built their claim along the south bank of the creek, a good site, sheltered from the north wind by a low ridge of mixed timber. The cabin was solid. The kitchen garden was productive. They kept 4 dairy cows, and the cows gave enough milk and butter to see them through the winters and sell a small surplus in Brainerd in summer. Then Gunnar got sick. It came on in the autumn of 1877, which is too soon to say when it started. These things always started earlier than anyone noticed. A cough that hung on after a cold. Some mornings he moved slower than others. By the winter of 1878, he was sleeping more than a well man sleeps, and by the spring of 1879, there were days he did not go out at all. He died in October of that year, on a clear, cold morning, with frost on the windows, with Ingrid and the 3 children present, and the 4 cows in the barn, 40 steps from the door, making the sounds that cows make when the morning feeding is late. He left behind an unfinished woodpile, an unpainted south wall on the cabin, a pair of boots that needed resoling, and a set of harness buckles he had promised himself he would fix the following week. He left these things not out of carelessness, but out of the ordinary confidence that there would be a following week, and then another after that. None of us plan well for the end. Gunnar was no different. What he did not leave behind was instructions, a plan, any indication of what Ingrid was supposed to do next. She was 40 years old. She spoke English haltingly, enough to purchase flour and salt pork at the general store, enough to exchange the necessary words with neighbors, not enough to argue or explain or make herself fully understood in the moments that required full understanding. She had Lars, 17, and Eric, 14, both strong and willing, neither of them yet a man in the way that the work of a frontier farm requires a man. And she had Astrid, 9, who asked questions constantly and remembered everything and understood far more than anyone gave her credit for. The first winter without Gunnar, 1879 to 1880, she managed. I will not say she managed easily. The wood Gunnar had cut that autumn was not enough, and it was green besides, and the stove ran on smoke and stubbornness through February. One of the dairy cows died in January, the oldest one, the one Gunnar had called by name, which none of the others had names. She died not of cold exactly, but of cold and age combined, the way hard times always find what is already weakening. Ingrid walked out that morning in the dark, saw the cow down, and stood in the calf-deep snow for a long time without moving. Lars watched her from the cabin window and did not go out to her. He said later that something about how she stood told him she needed to be alone with it. She came in after a while. She did not say anything about the cow. She started the stove and made the morning porridge and divided it among the children, and then stood at the kitchen window, drinking her coffee and looking at the barn. That was when I think it began. Not from grief exactly, from arithmetic. By the time the snow melted in March of 1880, she had already begun to see the shape of the problem. Not the wood is running out problem. That was a symptom, not the illness. The real problem was time. Green wood needed 6 months of open air and moving wind to dry enough to burn well. 6 months meant cutting in spring and burning in fall, or cutting in summer and burning the following winter. Either way, the cycle required preparation that was a full season ahead of need. She had not been a full season ahead. She suspected many of her neighbors were not a full season ahead. And she was the only one, as far as she could tell, who was thinking about this distinction. In April, she walked the south wall of her cabin on a morning after a hard frost and noticed what she had probably walked past 100 times without registering. The south wall was clear of snow. The frost on that side was already melting in the mid-morning sun, while the north side of the cabin still sat in blue shadow and hard ice. She put her palm flat against the south-facing logs and held it there. They were warm. Not warm the way a stove is warm, but warm the way a sleeping animal is warm, holding heat that the sun had put into them over weeks and months, giving it back slowly through the cold nights. She stood there with her hand on that wall for a long time. Lars saw her from the window. He mentioned it to me many years later, when he was a middle-aged man with his own farm and his own lean-to built just the way his mother had built hers. He said she stood so still, he thought at first something was wrong. Then he realized she was just looking at something, or thinking about something, in that particular way she had, where the rest of her went quiet, and whatever was in her mind was getting her full attention. He did not go out and disturb her. He had learned by then that this was not the time to go out and disturb her. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and drew lines on it. Not a proper drawing. She was not a draftsman and made no pretense of being one. Just lines. The shape of something. The angle of a roof, a floor set up from the ground, a wall of vertical boards with spaces between them, and above it all, a solid roof line running from the cabin wall outward and down. Astrid watched from across the table. She was 9 and curious about everything, and not afraid to ask. "What is that?" she said in Norwegian. They spoke Norwegian at home, all of them, always. Ingrid looked at the drawing for a moment before she answered. "Your grandfather's woodshed," she said, "the one that stood against the south side of his house in Telemark. I never saw it. I know, you weren't born yet." She paused, tracing one of the lines with her finger. "I was 8 years old the first time I walked into it in winter. The floor was raised up off the ground, boards on low posts so the air could move underneath. The walls were boards set apart, not tight together, so the wind could come through, but the rain couldn't get in sideways. And there was a roof over all of it, tight and solid. Your grandfather said the wind did the work. You just had to give the wind a path." Astrid looked at the drawing. "That's what you're going to build?" Ingrid folded the paper carefully and set it at the edge of the table. "That's what we're going to build," she said. Outside, the last of the March snow was settling into the mud, and the creek was running dark and fast with snowmelt. And somewhere north of the ridge line, the first geese of spring were moving through, though you couldn't hear them from inside the cabin with the stove going. It was the kind of evening that feels, in that country, like a door opening, like whatever had been held closed all winter was finally giving way. Ingrid went to bed early. She always went to bed early in those years. There was no one to talk to after the children were down, and talking to herself had never been her habit. But that night she lay awake a long time, going over the drawing in her mind, checking it against the memory she had carried from Norway for 11 years without knowing she would need it. She was not certain she remembered correctly. That uncertainty would stay with her all summer, but it would not stop her. It almost never did. I should tell you how I came to know the inside of that story, the parts that happened in the cabin, the conversations in Norwegian that I was not present for. Because a man who tells a story ought to be honest about where his information comes from, and what he is certain of versus what he has reasoned out or been told secondhand. I knew Ingrid Solberg for many years. I knew her well enough to tip my hat at a distance and to speak plainly at close range, which is a kind of knowing that serves well on the frontier, where people are too busy for pretense and too tired for anything other than the direct approach. What I saw with my own eyes I will tell you as such. What Lars told me over many years and several conversations, I will tell you as his. And what Astrid told me, she was an old woman by then and I was not far behind her, I will tell you as hers. Between the three of us, I believe we have assembled something close to the truth of that summer. I will let you know, where it matters, which is which. What Ingrid understood about the south wall, and this is the part I want to be careful to explain correctly, because people get it wrong when they tell it quickly. What she understood was not simply that the south side of things is warmer in winter. Every farmer on the Crow Wing knew that much. Cows sleep on the south side of the barn. Seedlings go in cold frames facing south. You put your kitchen garden on the south side of whatever windbreak you have. This is not knowledge, this is habit. Half the county did these things without knowing why, the way people say grace before a meal without considering the words. What Ingrid understood was why. The south wall of her cabin received direct sunlight for the better part of the day from October through March, when the sun runs low and southern, and every hour of warmth it offers is a gift. That wall absorbed heat. The wood stored it slowly across weeks and months, not in any one dramatic quantity, but in the steady, patient way that mass stores energy. On clear days in February, when the air temperature was 20 below, the surface of that south wall was warmer than the air by 20 degrees or more. By midday, sometimes 30. Now, if you were to stack dry firewood against that wall, stacked loosely, not packed tight so the air could circulate between the pieces, and if you were to put a roof over it that shed the snow and rain, and if you were to leave the sides open enough that the wind could move through freely, you would have, in effect, a slow kiln. The sun warming the wall warming the air immediately against it. The wind carrying that slightly warmed air through the woodpile, taking moisture with it as it went. Day after day, week after week, from June through October, while the family went about their summer work. Wood that went in green in June would come out dry enough to burn well by November. Not perfectly seasoned, you would want a full year for that, ideally 2, but dry enough to catch quickly and burn clean and put out the heat a Minnesota night requires. That was the insight. It sounds simple when I say it plainly like this. Most true things do. The lean-to structure was not the insight. The lean-to was just the shape the insight took when it needed to become something you could build. She spent the month of May on the design. I know this from Astrid, who was her mother's closest observer in those years, not because Ingrid confided in her exactly, but because Astrid paid attention in the way that quiet, watchful children pay attention, storing details against some future need she couldn't yet identify. Astrid told me that her mother drew the same structure on paper 3 separate times that month, each time crumpling the previous version and starting again. Not because the basic shape changed, it didn't, not significantly, but because she was checking something. Each time she drew it, she would stop at a particular point and sit very still with the pencil resting on the paper, and then she would draw the line again, slightly differently, and study what she had drawn. Astrid asked her once what she was doing. Ingrid said, in Norwegian, "Making sure I remember." Remember what? The floor, how high it was from the ground. Astrid thought about this. Couldn't you just choose a height? Ingrid looked at her for a moment. Your grandfather chose a height, she said. It was the right height. I am trying to remember what he chose. This is the thing I want you to hold on to, because it is the thing that made Ingrid's design different from an educated guess. She was not inventing. She was recovering something. The structure she was trying to build had existed already, had worked already over many Norwegian winters in a climate not entirely unlike this one, and she had experienced it firsthand as a child. Not observed it the way you observe something you're studying. Experienced it the way you experience anything at the age of 8, which is to say with your whole body, without analysis. The way the cold morning air of the woodshed felt against her face, the particular sound the raised floorboards made underfoot, the smell of dry wood and pine resin, and the faint warmth held overnight in the logs her father had split and stacked the previous summer. She was not working from theory, she was working from memory. And the difference matters enormously, because memory carries information that theory cannot. The small, specific, precise details that a person who designed something arrived at through trial and error over years, and that another person, inheriting the design, doesn't have to earn again from scratch. The floor was 18 inches from the ground. She was nearly certain of that. Certain enough that when she finally put the stakes in the earth that marked the foundation line, she measured 18 inches with a length of cord knotted at that distance and did not second-guess it. The angle of the roof was the other thing she worked at carefully. Here she was less certain from memory and more dependent on reasoning. The roof needed to be steep enough that snow would slide off rather than accumulate, but not so steep as to waste timber in the framing or to create a structure that the wind could get underneath and push against. She thought about this for several evenings, watching the existing barn roof in different lights, estimating the angle with her eye. When Elias Marsh came and looked, I will come to that shortly, he told her, as nearly as he could figure with a bevel square, that she had arrived at 37 degrees, which is, I can tell you from my own experience, very close to the best angle for a roof in this latitude, given our average snowfall and wind patterns. She got there not by calculation, but by looking at something for long enough that her eye found the right answer. I have known perhaps 3 people in my life who could do that reliably. She was one of them. Construction began the first week of June. Lars and Eric did the heavy work, digging the post holes, hauling the timber, cutting and fitting the frame members. Lars was 17 and already carrying most of the physical strength of a grown man, though he hadn't yet settled into it, still had the loose, uncertain quality of someone whose body has outpaced his understanding of it. Eric was 14 and lighter but quick, and he had a gift for following instructions without requiring them to be explained twice, which was a considerable virtue when the instructions were being given partly in Norwegian and partly in hand gestures. Ingrid directed. This is the only word for it. She did not stand back and supervise in the way of a foreman who has other things on his mind. She was present at every stage, moving around the work, crouching to look at something from below, climbing occasionally to look at something from above, placing her hand on a joint or a post the way I had seen experienced carpenters check their own work, not examining it so much as listening to it, feeling for the thing that was not quite right. She carried the drawing with her, folded in her apron pocket. She took it out several times a day and looked at it. Lars told me she sometimes looked at it for a minute without looking at the construction at all, as though she was checking the building against the drawing rather than the drawing against the building. He said it in a bemused way, the way children describe the habits of parents they have not quite figured out. The framing went up in the first 2 weeks. The posts, the horizontal members, the rafters, all of this was straightforward enough carpentry, nothing that an experienced eye would stop at. What stopped an experienced eye, my eye when I first came to look, was the walls, or rather the absence of walls in the conventional sense. The sides of the lean-to were not clad in the usual way, with boards run tight against each other to seal out the weather. Instead, she had Lars and Eric nail boards vertically, with gaps between them, gaps roughly the width of 2 fingers, so that air could pass freely through from any direction. The whole structure was open to the wind on 3 sides, closed only at the back where it met the cabin wall. Only the roof was solid and continuous, sloped and close-fitted, shedding water in every direction away from the firewood stacked below. I came to look in the second week of July. I had heard about it from Olaf Stenstrom, who had heard about it from his wife, who had heard about it from someone at the church, and what I had heard was imprecise. The widow Solberg was building something odd, probably a mistake, possibly a sign of strain. I came not to judge, but to see. I had learned early in my working life that odd-looking structures are sometimes the most interesting ones, and that people who build without formal training occasionally arrive by instinct and necessity at solutions that trained men have simply never needed to discover. I tied my horse at the fence and walked around the structure twice before I spoke to anyone. The boys were working on the roof at that point, fitting the final courses of boards, and Ingrid was below watching them. She heard me approach and turned, and we looked at each other for a moment in the way that strangers do when neither one is sure how much the other speaks their language. I pointed at the gap-boarded sides. "The wind comes through," I said. She looked at me steadily. Her English was careful and a little slow, chosen with the precision of someone who has a smaller vocabulary than the thought requires. "The wind comes through," she agreed. "That is the point." I stood there and thought about it. The wood that would be stacked inside those open walls would get wind on all sides, all day, all season, but it would not get rained on, would not get snowed on, because the roof above it was solid and overhanging. Air moving, moisture not moving, which was exactly the condition that dried wood. "The south wall gives heat," I said slowly, working it out as I spoke. "The wind takes the damp." She nodded once. Whether she understood my exact words or was simply confirming that I had grasped the general idea, I couldn't be certain. It hardly mattered. I walked over to where the lean-to met the cabin wall and crouched down and looked at the floor framing. 18 inches from the ground, with the joists running on short posts set into the earth. I stood back up and looked at the roof angle, somewhere around 35-40 degrees. I didn't have a square with me that day, but I've estimated angles long enough that my eye is reliable within a few degrees. "Where did you learn this?" I asked her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without any particular emphasis, as though it were simply a fact of the world, "My father's house in Norway." I nodded. I understood then that there was nothing more to explain. She had not invented this. She had inherited it in the way people inherit most of the things that save them, not from books, not from deliberate teaching, but from having lived inside the right thing at the right age, before they knew enough to take it for granted. "You'll need more lumber for the corridor section," I said. I had noticed the stakes she had set in the earth running from the lean-to toward the barn. An enclosed passage, from the look of it, maybe 12 feet of covered ground between the two structures. She looked at the stakes, then back at me. She said 2 words. "Ask Lars." I found out what she meant by that 3 weeks later, when Lars told me he had spent 2 Saturdays in June working for the Halverson brothers in exchange for enough framing lumber to finish the corridor. He had not told his mother he was going to do this. He had simply done it, and arrived home with the lumber in the wagon one Sunday evening, and when Ingrid came out and looked at what was in the wagon and then looked at him, she had not said anything. She had just put her hand briefly on his shoulder, which Lars, telling me this as a grown man, said was the only time in his life he had been entirely certain that he had done exactly the right thing. This is the part of the story that people miss when they tell it quickly. They talk about Ingrid, as they should, but they forget that she had a 17-year-old boy who was ashamed of the project all summer in front of his friends, and who went out on 2 Saturdays and earned the lumber to finish it anyway because he trusted her even when he could not explain why. That is a different kind of courage from hers, not smaller, just quieter, and aimed in a different direction. Across the fence, through all of this, Anders Bjornstad watched. He came most evenings, not openly, not walking up to the property line and leaning on the post as a man might if he were simply curious. He came to the far end of his field, near the tree line, and stood in a way that could plausibly be explained by any number of farm-related reasons, and he looked at the lean-to going up. I noticed him there on 3 separate occasions. I do not think he noticed me noticing him. Anders had come from Telemark himself, from a village not 20 miles from where Ingrid had grown up. He had come to Minnesota in 1863, 17 years before this summer, and he had come with a deliberate intention to leave the old country behind, not because he disliked it, but because he had seen enough men spend their whole lives looking backward across the ocean to know that looking backward and moving forward are incompatible activities. He had learned English first, before his farm was even cleared. He had stopped speaking Norwegian in public by his 3rd year in the county, though he still thought in it sometimes, in his dreams, in moments of sharp feeling. He had built his farm the way the American farm manual said to build it, the way his American-born neighbors built, not the way his father and grandfather had built in Telemark. He was proud of this. He had worked hard at it. And now, a widow from the next valley over, a woman who had been in Minnesota 11 years and still reached for Norwegian when the English ran out, was building something against her south cabin wall that Anders recognized. Not from books, not from description. He recognized it the way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard since childhood, when the first few notes reach you and something older than memory sits up and pays attention. He recognized it because his father had built one, in Telemark, against the south wall of the family home. Before Anders had made his decision to become someone who did not think about such things, he stood at the tree line and watched Ingrid's boys raise the rafters, and I imagine, though this is the part I am reasoning rather than reporting, that he was experiencing something uncomfortable. The specific discomfort of a man who has discarded a thing and then watches someone else making use of it. Not quite regret, not quite anger, something in between with no clean name. He did not come over and offer to help. He did not come over and say what he recognized. He stood in his field and watched, and then he went back to his own barn, and in the morning the work on the lean-to continued without him. By the end of August, the frame was complete. The roof was on, tight and solid, shedding a test rain in late August without a single drip finding its way to the floor below. The corridor connecting the lean-to to the barn was framed and roofed, 12 feet of covered passage, 1 wall of board, and batten on the north side to block the prevailing wind, the south side open under the overhang, letting the light in. Ingrid walked through it. She walked from the cabin door, through the lean-to, running her hand along the stacked space where the wood would go, and through the corridor and into the barn and back again. She did this slowly, the way you read something you've written to hear, whether it sounds the way it was supposed to sound. Lars watched from the barn doorway. She came back through and stood in the lean-to for a moment and looked at the open sides, the south wall behind them, the solid roof above. The afternoon light came in long and level from the west, catching the dust that the construction had raised and laying it down in slow golden layers. She put her hand on the south-facing wall of the cabin, the original wall, the one she had stood with her palm flat against in April, still warm, even in late August, still holding the day's heat against the evening. She nodded once in the way she had of completing a thought that she had not started out loud, and went inside to start the supper. In September she began stacking wood. I want to tell you about the setbacks, because people who tell frontier stories often leave them out. They leave them out because setbacks interrupt the momentum of the telling, and because a story with too many obstacles begins to feel like a complaint rather than an account, and because the people who lived through those years were, on the whole, not much interested in their own suffering. They got up and fixed what had broken and did not spend a great deal of time discussing how it felt to have it break in the first place. This was not stoicism in the philosophical sense. It was simply the arithmetic of survival. If you spent an hour feeling badly about the thing that went wrong, you had 1 fewer hour to set it right before dark. But the setbacks happened, and they mattered. Because the moments when Ingrid Solberg could have stopped, could have looked at what had gone wrong and decided it was a sign, could have listened to the voices on the other side of the fence and admitted They had a point. Those were the real tests of the thing she was building. Not the structure, the decision. So I will tell you about the setbacks. The first came in early July, 3 weeks into the framing. The lean-to's east wall, the short end wall, the one that faced into the prevailing summer wind off the river bottom, was built on a post that Lars had set into a spot of ground that looked solid but was not. It was one of those patches you find along creek drainages where the subsurface holds moisture long after the surface is dried, and the post, which seemed firm enough when they drove it, shifted in a wet week in late June and took the bottom corner of the frame with it. Not dramatically, not a collapse, just a lean, 2 inches out of plumb, which is nothing in an old building and everything in a new one, because in a new building, 2 inches becomes 4 inches in the first hard wind, and 4 becomes 8. And then you are not repairing a lean, you are rebuilding a wall. Lars discovered it on a Monday morning and came inside and told his mother. Ingrid went out and looked at it for a while, crouching at the corner to sight along the base of the frame, then standing back and looking at it from 10 feet away. She did not say anything for several minutes. Lars told me, much later, that he had been preparing himself for her to say they should take that section down and start over, which would have cost them most of a week and some lumber they could not easily replace. He was also, he admitted, preparing himself to feel relieved if she said it, because it would have given him an excuse to tell the boys at Halverson's mill that the project had run into trouble, which felt easier than explaining what the project was in the first place. She did not say, start over. She said, dig around the post, 4 inches on each side. When you get down to where the wet is, pack it with gravel from the creek bed. Then brace it back to plumb with a temporary shore while the ground firms up around it. 3 days, then pull the shore and see if it holds. Lars looked at her. Where do I get gravel? The creek bed, she said. Where I just said. He got the gravel from the creek bed. He packed the post. He braced it. 3 days later, he pulled the shore, and the post held, and it held through the rest of the summer and through every winter I ever saw it stand, which was more than 30 years. The frame went up on schedule, but I tell you this because it was the week that Anders Bjornsted came to the fence line and said, loudly enough to be heard across the intervening ground, that a structure built on bad footings was a structure that should not have been started. He said this to no one in particular, which is the frontier way of saying something to someone in particular while maintaining the ability to deny it later. Lars heard him. He was in the creek bed at the time, up to his knees in cold water, filling a bucket with gravel. He did not respond. He came back up the bank and kept working. I was not there for this, Lars told me, but I have thought about it many times. A 17-year-old boy in cold water, doing work he had been given no detailed instructions for, overhearing a grown man tell the surrounding air that the whole effort was probably a mistake, and filling the bucket anyway, and climbing the bank anyway, and packing the gravel in around the post anyway, with hands that were cold enough to be clumsy. Some things cannot be taught. That was one of them. The second setback came in August, and this one was harder because it touched the part of the project that Ingrid had been most careful about, the roof boards. She had selected the timber for the roof with particular attention. She needed it straight-grained and as dry as available, because roof boards that cup or warp after installation open gaps that let the weather in, and the one thing the roof could not do was let the weather in. She had picked through the available lumber twice and set aside what she wanted, and Lars had hauled it in the wagon and stacked it under a tarpaulin near the build site. What she had not fully accounted for was August. That summer, the heat came in mid-August with a dry westerly wind that went on for nearly 2 weeks without relief. Temperatures in the high 80s, humidity dropping until the grass crackled underfoot in the afternoon, and the creek ran lower than anyone had seen it in 5 years. It was the kind of heat that farmers welcomed for the hay and cursed for everything else, and what it did to the stacked roof boards was to dry them faster and less evenly than slow air drying would have done. Boards that had been acceptably flat in July were showing a noticeable cup by the second week of August. Ingrid went out and looked at them on a Tuesday morning and stood there long enough that Astrid, watching from the cabin window, came outside to see what her mother was looking at. "Are they ruined?" Astrid asked. She was 9, and direct in the way that 9-year-olds are when they have not yet learned to soften questions. "No," Ingrid said, "but they need to go up differently." She spent that evening with the paper and pencil again. What she worked out, and here I am partly filling in from my own carpentry knowledge, because she explained it to me only roughly when I came to look, was a modified nailing pattern that pulled the boards tight to the framing members at closer intervals, limiting the degree to which any individual board could express its desire to curl. It was more nails and more time, but it was not more lumber, which was the critical constraint. I came by that Saturday and found Lars and Eric on the roof in the heat, working slowly and carefully through the modified pattern, and Ingrid below calling up occasional instructions. I climbed up and looked at what they were doing. It was correct. It would not be a perfect roof. No roof built from boards that have dried unevenly is ever perfect, but it would be a serviceable roof, which in that country was the only standard that mattered. I offered to help for the afternoon. Ingrid looked at me with that particular steadiness she had and said in careful English, "Do you know how to do this?" I said that I did. She said, "Then yes, thank you." We finished the roof in 2 days. It was the only direct help I gave her that summer. The rest was observation and the occasional answered question. I want to be accurate about this because there is a version of this story where I play a larger role than I did, and that version is not the true one. By the 1st of September, the structure was complete. What stood behind Ingrid Solberg's cabin on the south-facing slope above the creek was this: a lean-to 16 feet wide and 9 feet deep, its back wall flush against the cabin's south exterior, its roof sloping away from the cabin at roughly 37 degrees, open on the east, west, and south sides, with vertical boards spaced 2 fingers apart, so that the wind came through freely in every direction. The floor was raised on short posts, 18 inches from the ground, with air moving underneath. The roof was close-fitted and sound, overhanging the sides by 14 inches to shed water well clear of what would be stacked inside. Running east from the lean-to, connecting it to the barn, was the corridor. 12 feet of enclosed passage, roofed and solid. One wall of board and batten on the north side, open on the south under the roof's overhang. Not warm exactly in the way a heated room is warm, but sheltered from wind and precipitation, which in a Minnesota winter is the more critical protection. From inside the cabin you could walk through the lean-to and through the corridor and into the barn without stepping into open air, without touching the snow, without exposing yourself to the wind. I do not think Ingrid had planned this as the central feature of the design. I think she had planned it because, in Norway, connected farmsteads were common for practical reasons, and her father's farm had been connected in just this way. But I think she did not fully reckon with what it would mean in a winter like the one coming, until the winter came. September she spent filling the lean-to with wood. I say filling, by which I mean she stacked cord upon cord of firewood in the sheltered space along the south wall and out from it, building the rows carefully so that air could still circulate between the pieces, not packing them too tight, not sealing off the channels the wind needed to do its work. Lars and Eric cut for 2 weeks solid in the timber north of the ridge, splitting and hauling and stacking, and Ingrid organized the stacking herself, directing the placement the way a careful cook organizes a kitchen, each thing in its right position for the reason that position serves. By the end of September, the lean-to held 2 full winters' worth of firewood. Dry, covered, in the open air, warming in the residual heat of the south wall through the last mild weeks of autumn. She was done before the first killing frost. I need to tell you about October, because October is where the story's meaning lives, more than any of what came after. October of 1880 began with 2 weeks of weather so fine that people remarked on it as a gift. Clear days, light wind, temperatures mild enough that coat weather didn't come until mid-month. Old-timers said it was too nice. Old-timers always say the nice weather is too nice, but in this case they were right. The first storm came on the 18th. Not the worst storm, not by the standard of what the next 4 months would bring, but hard enough, early enough to be a statement of intent. Snow began in mid-afternoon, driven by a northwest wind that had been building since morning. By evening there were 8 inches on the ground, and the creek path was invisible, and the temperature had dropped to single digits. Ingrid woke before dawn the following morning, as she always did. She dressed by lamplight and opened the cabin door and stepped into the lean-to. The firewood was dry, the floor was dry. The cold air moved through the open side slowly, and where it touched the south wall of the cabin it was fractionally warmer than the ambient air, and that fractional warmth kept the space from achieving the particular punishing stillness of a sealed cold room. It was cold in the lean-to, but it was the working cold of an open structure, not the killing cold of the outdoors, and the wood stacked within it was dry and ready. She selected 3 pieces for the morning stove and carried them through the corridor into the cabin. She did not have to dig. She did not have to search. She did not have to carry wet, half-frozen wood in from the yard and set it near the stove to dry before it would burn. She opened a door and reached out her hand. I think about that a great deal. The distance between her cabin door and that firewood was approximately 6 feet. In an ordinary winter, those 6 feet were sometimes negotiable and sometimes were not, depending on the snow depth, the wind, the temperature, whether the wood pile had drifted over, whether the wood on top was frozen to the wood below it. 6 feet that might take 20 minutes, or that might not be safely crossable until the storm broke, which might not be until tomorrow or the day after that. She crossed those 6 feet in a single step. Through October and into November the weather built, not catastrophically, not all at once. This is not how hard winters announce themselves. They build the way a river rises in spring, steadily, inevitably, each day a little more than the day before, until you look at where the waterline was last week and understand that something has changed. The nights stayed colder longer into the morning. The creek froze earlier than it had in the 6 years since Ingrid had come to this land. The sky took on the particular bleached quality of a Minnesota winter sky when it means it. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just relentlessly white and close, as though the ceiling of the world had been lowered by a few hundred feet. In November, the Hartman family, young Germans who had come to the county the previous year and were spending their first full winter in the territory, began burning their stored wood faster than they had planned. Marta Hartman told her husband Dieter that they should have cut more. Dieter said they had cut plenty. They had both cut the wood available to them in the time available, which is what nearly everyone does, and what nearly everyone finds insufficient in a winter that exceeds the usual measure. Anders Bjornsted made no further remarks about footings or women doing men's work. He had said what he had said, and it was in the air now, not forgotten, not retracted, and he walked past the Solberg property on his way to the store without looking toward the lean-to, which is a way of looking at something very intently while pretending not to. He had 6 months' worth of wood, split and stacked in the yard in the usual way, covered with a piece of old canvas weighted down at the corners. It was good wood, better seasoned than most. In an ordinary winter, it would have seen him through. He did not yet know what kind of winter it was going to be. The first serious blizzard came on the 4th of December. It came without much warning. The sky had been overcast for 3 days, and the temperature had been dropping. But those conditions described most of November, and nobody had thought to read them as a particular announcement. Then, on the morning of the 4th, the wind shifted to the north-northwest, and the sky went from white to gray to the particular moving darkness that means weather is not approaching, but arriving, has already arrived, is here. By midday you could not see the fence line from the cabin window. By mid-afternoon you could not see the fence line from the doorway. By evening, there was no going outside except to die from it, which is not an exaggeration. The wind was sustained at a speed that took the breath from your mouth before you could draw it in, and the snow it carried was not falling so much as flying, horizontal and unrelenting, filling any gap it found in any structure not built to exclude it. Ingrid lit the stove. She fed it through the evening with wood that she had carried in from the lean-to that morning, dry, split, seasoned through the summer and fall into exactly the fuel she needed it to be. The stove reached temperature in 20 minutes and held it without complaint. The cabin was warm. Through the corridor, in the barn, the 4 dairy cows stood in the way that cattle stand in cold weather, close together, their collective warmth rising and condensing in the rafters above them. The corridor, sheltered from the direct wind by the board and batten north wall, held just above freezing. The barn, with 4 adult animals in it producing the steady biological heat of living things, was warmer than the corridor. Not warm in the way a house is warm, but survivable. More than survivable. Lars went through the corridor to check on them at 9 o'clock that night, pulling his coat closed against the cold of the passage. He checked each cow, ran his hand along their sides, gave them hay from the stack near the south wall. When he came back, he told his mother they were fine. She nodded and did not look up from the mending she was doing by lamplight, because she had expected them to be fine, and expectation confirmed is not news. Astrid was already asleep. Eric was reading, or looking at a book at least, which passes for reading in lamplight after a long physical day. The stove ticked and settled. The wind against the walls was tremendous, a sound like sustained pressure rather than movement, as though something enormous was leaning against the outside of the cabin and would not be done leaning until it decided to stop. Ingrid set down the mending and looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she got up and opened the cabin door into the lean-to, not to go in, just to look. The wind came in sideways through the open sides, rattling nothing, disturbing nothing, because there was nothing in there to rattle or disturb except the stacked wood, which was too solid and too heavy to be moved by wind. The south wall of the cabin rose above the firewood, dark in the lamplight, holding its warmth. She stood there for a moment in the cold air of the lean-to doorway, looking at the wood. Then she closed the door and went back to her mending. Outside, the blizzard continued. It would continue for 3 more days. And across the fence, in the gray dark of that same night, Anders Bjornstad went out into the storm to his woodpile and spent 40 minutes digging through 2 feet of wind-driven snow to reach the wood underneath. What he found when he reached it was this. The canvas cover had blown partially free. The top 3 layers of his carefully stacked wood were wet. Not soaked, wet. Enough that they would smoke more than they burned. Enough that they would need to sit near the stove for an hour before they were any use to anyone. He carried what he could in 2 arms and fought back to the cabin through the wind. He did not look toward the Solberg property. It was too dark to see anything, and the snow was moving too fast. But I think he knew, even then, what he would have seen if he had looked. January is when a Minnesota winter stops introducing itself and begins to say what it actually means. The December storms had been hard, but December storms carry with them a kind of provisional quality. They are the opening statements of a season still establishing its character, and experienced people know not to judge the whole winter by them. There is always the possibility, in December, that things will moderate, that the worst has already come. That February will be kinder than November suggested. January of 1881 removed that possibility entirely. The temperature on the morning of January the 3rd was 41 degrees below zero by the thermometer that hung outside the general store in town, which is where I was that morning, having made the trip in from my place the day before, when there was a brief clearing. I stood and looked at that thermometer for a long time. I had seen 30 below before, and 35. I had not seen 41. The number had a quality of abstraction to it. It was so far beyond the range of ordinary human experience that it was difficult to connect it to anything physical. And then you stepped outside and it connected immediately. Your breath did not mist. It crackled. The hair inside your nose froze in the first inhalation. The cold was not cold the way winter cold is cold. It was a different thing entirely, a kind of aggressive absence, as though heat itself had been repealed. I stayed in town 3 more days before it moderated enough to make the road home passable. In those 3 days, I heard things. The particular kind of information that passes between people who are beginning to understand that they are in genuine trouble and are taking stock. The Peterson family, 4 miles north, had burned through their accessible wood by Christmas and were into the fence rails. The Halverson boys had killed one of their horses, not from cold, from the calculation that a dead horse would feed the family through February when their salt pork ran out. The mail road to Brainerd had been impassable since mid-December. The nearest doctor was in Brainerd. This fact was stated quietly, without elaboration, by a man whose youngest daughter had developed a fever, which is the frontier way of asking for help that does not exist. And through all of this, through every conversation in those 3 days at the general store, one fact returned in various forms, stated by different people at different moments, as though each person had arrived at it independently and was surprised to find the others had arrived there too. The Solberg widow, they said. Warm. The boys seen in the yard without distress. The livestock apparently sound, smoke from her stovepipe steady and clean. Clean meaning dry wood, meaning wood that burned rather than smoldered, meaning wood that was doing its job. Nobody said what this meant yet. It was January, and the winter was not finished, and people on the frontier are careful about drawing conclusions before the evidence is complete. But they noticed. They stored the observation the way you store wood, not for immediate use, but against a future need. I want to tell you about the morning of January the 17th. I was home by then, had been home for 10 days, and the cold had moderated to something that was merely brutal rather than categorical, perhaps 15 below at night, rising to 0 or a few above in the afternoon if the sun was out, which it occasionally was, that hard white winter sun that gives light and no heat, and makes the snow surface glitter as though the ground itself is conducting electricity. I went out that morning before first light to see to my own animals, and on my way back to the cabin I stopped at the fence line that marked the boundary between my property and the open ground that ran down to the creek road. From where I stood, if the air was clear and the light was beginning, I could see the Solberg property on the far side of the creek bottom. It was perhaps a 1/4 mile. What I saw was this. A lamp came on in the cabin, the small, steady glow of it in the window, which meant someone was up and beginning the morning. Then, within a few minutes, a figure emerged from the cabin door into the lean-to, not hurrying, not struggling, walking in the ordinary way of a person who is doing a familiar thing in a familiar place. And it was Ingrid. I was certain of that from the way she moved and her height and the particular quality of her stillness. When she paused, she leaned down and selected pieces of firewood from the stacked rows. 3 pieces, 4. She gathered them in her arms in the unhurried way you carry things when they are simply there to be carried, not fought for. Then she went back through the cabin door. A few minutes later, the smoke from her stovepipe thickened and steadied, which meant the fire had taken hold on dry wood that caught cleanly. I stood at my fence line in the dark and the cold, and I watched all of this. I do not know how long I stood there, long enough that the cold worked through my coat to the wool beneath, which is long enough. I was a carpenter of 30 years. I had built things that worked, and things that almost worked, and a few things that did not work at all. And I knew the difference from the inside, from the feeling of it, the way a musician knows a true note from a near miss by something that has nothing to do with theory. What I watched Ingrid do that morning was not impressive in the way of a great structure or a difficult feat. It was impressive in the way of a well-fitted joint, so exactly right, so completely suited to its purpose that the effort behind it became invisible and only the rightness remained. She had carried firewood from a sheltered place to a stove, that was all. And across this county, in that same hour, other women and men were pulling on every piece of clothing they owned to dig through chest-deep drifts, or prying apart frozen logs with cold, stiffened hands, or feeding smoke-heavy fires that chilled more than they warmed, or making calculations about how many fence rails remained between themselves and a fireless night. She had carried firewood from a sheltered place to a stove. The distance was 6 feet. The wood was dry. The stove caught in 20 minutes. I went inside and made my own fire and sat beside it for a long time before I began the day's work. And I thought about what I had watched, and I thought about what the summer had looked like from the fence, and I thought about the things I had not said loudly enough or often enough to the people who had called it peculiar. That is a thought that has a weight to it. It is not a crushing weight, but it does not go away. The winter held through February. In some ways, February was the hardest month because by February, the accumulated deprivation of November, December, and January had found all the weaknesses in every household's preparation, and the weaknesses were showing. Anders Bjornstad lost 4 of his 7 cattle. He did not lose them all at once. Animals do not typically die all at once, which would be in some ways more merciful. He lost them over 6 weeks, 1 or 2 at a time, the older ones first, then the ones that had come into the winter already stressed from a poor grazing season. By the end of February, he had 3 animals left, and those 3 he moved into the nearest outbuilding, which was a tool shed not built for the purpose, and he burned extra wood he could not easily spare to keep that space above freezing. He did not lose the 3 that remained. They came through. But the cost of it, the firewood burned, the days spent managing an arrangement that should not have been necessary, was written into his face by March in a way that was not there in October. The Hartman boy, Heinrich, recovered fully from his fever. Marta Hartman had kept him alive through 3 nights of serious illness by building up the fire in the room where he slept and staying awake to tend it, feeding it with wood that was never quite dry enough, keeping the fire going by attention rather than by efficiency. She was a capable woman, and she kept her son alive, and I want to be clear about that. But she told me the following summer, when we spoke about those nights, that she had measured the wood remaining every morning with her eyes, the way you measure water in a canteen in dry country, and that the margin had been narrow enough to be frightening. She used that word, frightening, without any drama, as a simple description of a fact. The wood had been close to running out. The child had needed heat. The distance between those 2 facts and a different outcome was not large. She did not say Ingrid's name in this conversation. She did not need to. She had spent all of July and August watching Ingrid's construction from the distance of a neighbor who was interested but whose husband had opinions about what was and wasn't sensible building. She had memorized details without meaning to. She already knew, going into that February, what she was going to build as soon as the ground was open in spring. March came slowly, the way it always does in that country, not arriving so much as accumulating, a few degrees at a time, a few minutes more of usable light each day, the angle of the sun changing almost imperceptibly until one morning you step outside and the air carries a quality of possibility it has not carried in 4 months. The snow settled, not melted, settled, compressing under its own weight into something dense and gray that would not be gone until April, but that relinquished its grip on the landscape in a way you could feel. People began to move, and when people began to move, they came to look at the thing that had interested them all winter from a distance. They came in the way that people come to look at something they have already decided to understand, not with the open skepticism of the previous summer, but with the particular focused attention of individuals who have a practical question and intend to find its answer. How was the floor framed? What was the gap between the wall boards? How was the roof joined to the cabin wall? Was it the angle of the roof or the direction it faced, or both? Anders Bjornstad came alone on a Thursday morning without announcing himself. He stood at the edge of the property for a moment and then walked to the door and knocked. Lars answered. He looked at Anders for a moment, this man who had stood at the fence line all summer, making his opinions felt without quite stating them. And then he opened the door wider and called back into the cabin. Ingrid came to the door. They stood and looked at each other in the pale March light. Anders was a tall man, taller than Ingrid, and he had aged through the winter in the visible way that hard seasons age the people they do not break entirely. She looked as she always looked, contained, attentive, not unfriendly but not performing friendliness either. He spoke in Norwegian, the first Norwegian she had heard from him in the years they had been neighbors. Kan jeg se? Can I see? Not a question, quite. The phrasing of a man who knows he does not have the standing to demand and is not certain he has the standing to ask, but is asking anyway because he has run out of alternatives. Ingrid considered him for a moment. Then she turned into the cabin and came back with an extra coat, an old coat of Gunnar's, heavy wool, that she kept on the peg near the door for outdoor work. She held it out to him. "Still cold," she said, in Norwegian. He took the coat. He put it on without comment. She led him through the lean-to, walking slowly, letting him see the floor framing, the spaced wall boards, the way the south wall of the cabin rose behind the stacked wood, still partially filled, a third of the winter's supply remaining, dry and ready for a cold snap that might still come in April. She led him through the corridor and into the barn and back again, and at each point she stopped for a moment and let him look without explaining, because she had learned, in a life mostly conducted in a language not her own, that the thing observed often communicates better than the thing described. At the lean-to, he stopped and looked at the raised floor for a long time. He crouched and looked underneath it, at the airspace, at the way the ground was dry and the joists were clean, and the wood above them showed none of the black mottling that ground moisture leaves on timber over time. He stood up. "My father built this," he said, in Norwegian. "The same thing, in Telemark." "I know," Ingrid said. "Mine too." He nodded. He looked at the south wall of the cabin, the wall that had given her the idea, or rather the wall that had given her back the memory of the idea, which is a different and more important thing. "I forgot," he said. She did not say that she had not forgotten, though she hadn't. She did not say anything at all that could be understood as an accusation, because she was not an accusatory woman, and because the winter had cost him enough without adding to the cost. She said, "The floor wants to be 18 inches from the ground, not less." He looked at her. "When you build yours," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would remember, and he did. "I built the framing for his lean-to that summer, and the floor was 18 inches from the ground to the inch, and he checked it himself 3 times before we moved on to the walls.